didn't read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing for every dog from Puget Sound to San Diego, because men groping in the Arctic darkness had found a yellow metal, gold. Overnight, thousands of men rushed into the Northland, and these men wanted dogs, heavy dogs, with hard muscles and furry coats to protect them from the frost. Buck was born in a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley of California, Judge Miller's place. There were great stables, rows of servants' cottages, and green pastures. This is where Buck lived. Here for the 4 years of his life. He ruled. There were other dogs. They didn't count. The whole realm was his. He plunged into the swimming pool with the judge's sons, escorted the judge's daughters on early morning rambles, and on winter nights, curled up at the judge's feet. See, Buck's father, Elmo, huge St. Bernard, was the judge's inseparable companion. Buck's 140 pounds carried the dignity that comes with good living and universal respect. During the 4 years since his puppyhood, he lived the life of a sated aristocrat. This was Buck's life. In the fall of 1897, when the discovery of gold in the Klondike dragged men from all over the planet to the frozen world of the North. Buck didn't read newspapers. And he didn't know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, whom he thought friend, was scheming against him. Manuel had a gambling problem. He lost. And he lost often. The night of Manuel's treachery, the judge was out at a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, the boys off playing football with their friends. No one was there when Manuel attached a rope to Buck's collar and led him off into the orchard. That's when Buck first heard the voice of the man in the red sweater. You might wrap up the goods before you deliver them, man. That's it, boy. You're coming with me now. In quick range, Buck sprang at the man. To his surprise, the rope tightened, shutting off his breath. Watch it there, boy. I'll choke you down to the ground. You never had a rope around your neck, see? I'm the one in charge. Now, help me here, Manuel. We gotta get him down to the station, crate him up, toss him in a baggage car. Buck lay there for the remainder of the weary night, nursing the wrath that boiled in his heart. What do they want with me? Why are they keeping me in this terrible crate? The train car shook the entire night. Every time he heard the door rattle, he jumped to his feet, expecting the judge or one of the boys. And each time, it was the bulging face of the man in the red sweater. For 2 days and nights, Buck neither ate nor drank. And during those 2 days and nights of torment, he accumulated a fund of wrath that boded ill for whoever first fell foul of him. In Seattle, 4 men carried his crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. Buck saw the man in the red sweater and hurled himself against the bars. The man smiled grimly and retrieved a hatchet and a club. You ain't gonna take him out now? Asked the driver. Sure I am. The man brought down the hatchet, splintering wood and breaking open the crate. Buck was ready. Hair bristling, mouth foaming, mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes, he launched his 140 pounds of fury straight at the man. in midair. Just as his jaws were about to snap shut, he received a shock that checked his body and brought his teeth together with an agonizing clip. Buck had never been struck by a club. He didn't understand. He staggered limply about, blood flowing from his mouth and ears. With a roar like a lion, he charged again. But the man shifted and caught him under the jaw. Buck described a complete circle in the air and crashed to the ground on his head and chest.
Answers to the name of Buck,
the man soliloquized, quoting from the letter which had announced the consignment to the crate and contents.
Well, Buck, my boy, seems we've had our little ruction. Best thing you can do, let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, all go well. Who's saying hi? Be a bad dog, and I'll whale the stuffing out of you. Understand?
Buck was beat. He knew that, but he was not broken. He knew he stood no chance against a man with a club. He learned the lesson and would never forget it. That club was a revelation, an introduction to the reign of primitive law. As the days went by, other dogs came in crates and at the ends of ropes. One and all, Buck saw them pass under the dominion
of the man in the red sweater.
Buck's time came in the form of a little weazened man who spoke broken English and many strange and uncouth exclamations, which Buck could not understand. That one good dang dog. How much he be?
300. And seeing how it's government money, you ain't got nothing to worry about, huh? Perrault.
Perrault grinned. Considering the price of dogs booming, is the Canadian government for whom he worked delivering mail being no loser. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew. Oh, he won in 1,000s. 1 in 10,000s. Buck saw money pass between them and was not surprised when another dog, Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland, was led away with them. That was the last he saw
of the man in the red sweater.
And the last time he would ever feel the warmth of the southern sun. They were taken to the boat, Narwhal, where they were introduced to Perrault's partner, Francois. Buck learned quickly that Perrault and Francois were fair men and too wise and ways up north to be fooled by dogs. Day and night, the Narwhal throbbed to the pulse of the propeller, and though one day was very much like another, it was apparent to Buck that the weather was steadily growing colder. One morning, the propeller stopped. And the whole ship filled with excitement. Francois brought Buck up to the main deck, and his feet sank into a white, mushy something, sort of like mud. He sprang back. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, but more fell on him. He licked up some on his tongue. It bit like fire, and the next instant was gone. Buck was confused. And Francois gave a chuckle. It was his first snow. Buck's first day on the Daya Beach was a nightmare. Every hour filled with shock and surprise. These men and dogs were savages. He'd never seen dogs fight as wolfish creatures fought. Curly, his only friend, was the first victim. They were camped near the log store, and Curly, in her friendly way, made advances towards a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf. He was larger, stronger,
Mean and menace in every muscle. His name was Spitz.
Curly only sniffed up to say hello. There was no warning. Like a wolf who fights by striking and leaping away,
Spitz attacks Curly again and again. Ah!
30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the combatants in an intent and silent circle, licking their chops. In a final move to save her life, Curly rushed Spitz,
who struck her again, knocking her to the ground.
This is what the huskies were waiting for. They closed in on Curly, snarling and yelping, until she was buried, screaming with agony beneath the mass of dogs. Francois jumped in swinging an axe. Get gone now, you dang dogs! I'll bust you up good! Jumping in like that! You lazy cowards! Every one of you! The dogs scattered. Buck saw Curly, his only friend, laying there, limp and lifeless, in the bloody trampled snow. The scene often came to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So that is the way. No fair play. Once down, that's the end of it. He would see to it, he would never go down. In his mind, Buck saw Spitz run out his scarlet tongue in a way he had of laughing. In that moment, Buck hated him with a bitter and deathless hatred. Before he had a chance to recover from the shock of Curly's death, Buck received another shock. Francois fastened him with an odd set of straps and buckles. Now, let me get it on you, Buck. You get used to it quick as in spit. It was a harness, such as he had seen the grooms put on the horses at home. It's what we call the traces, huh? Be your best friends from here on out. Buck didn't mind the work. It gave him purpose. Their first job was to haul Francois on a sled to a forest that fringed the valley and return with a load of firewood. Buck's team kept him in line, closest to the sled. Dave, an experienced wheeler who nipped the back of Buck's heels when he was an Arab.
Spitz, the experienced leader, out front. He cunningly threw his weight in the traces to jerk Buck in the way he should go.
Buck learned easily under the tuition of his mates and made quick progress. He learned to stop at home, to go ahead at mush, to swing wide in the bends, and stay clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot downhill at their heels. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. His owner's tent glowed warmly. And when he tried to sneak in, both Perrault and Francois bombarded him with curses and cooking utensils. Get out, you mingling rat! He lay down in the snow and tried to sleep. But the frost drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable, he wandered around the many tents. Here and there, savage dogs rushed upon him. He bristled his hair and snarled. Finally, an idea came to him. He would see how his teammates were making out. To his astonishment, they disappeared. With a drooping tail. body, Buck aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly, the snow gave way beneath his legs and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back. A friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. And there, under the snow, curled up in a snug ball, lay Billy.
So that's the way they did it, eh?
Buck confidently selected a spot, and with much fuss, dug a hole for himself. Come morning, he didn't know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. All the muscles in his body contracted, and he bounded straight up to his feet. And what'd I say, huh? I speak true when I say that Buck learn quick as anything. It was a hard day's run. Up the canyon, through sheep camp, past the scales and timberline, across glaciers and snowdrifts, hundreds of feet deep, day after day. Buck toiled in the traces. His development was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron. He could eat anything, no matter how vile. Not only did he learn by experience, but instincts, long dead, became alive again. He could feel his ancestors in his bones. On the still, cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled, long and wolf-like. It was his ancestors, dead in dust, pointing nose at a star, howling down through the centuries, through him. All this because men had found a yellow metal in the north. And because Manuel was a gardener's helper who couldn't pay his debts. The dominant primordial beast was strong in bulk, and under the fierce conditions of trail life, it grew. At Lake Labarge, darkness forced them to grope for a camping place. They couldn't have fared any worse. Perrault and Francois laid out their sleeping bags on the ice of the lake itself. Buck made his nest. So warm and snug was it. He was loath to leave it when Francois distributed the fish. The thermometer reached 50 below. And a dozen times, the team nearly froze when the ice broke, plunging them into the freezing water. Perrault's skill at quickly building a fire was the only thing to save them. Buck's feet were not nearly as hard and compact as the feet of the Huskies. They'd softened during the many generations since his last wild ancestor was tamed by a cave dweller. All day long he limped in agony. Hungry as he was, he couldn't move to receive his ration of fish. Francois rubbed Buck's feet and made him a set of 4 little moccasins. Francois and Perrault laughed one morning when, forgetting moccasins, find Buck lying on back, waving feet in the air, calling for his shoes. They eventually wore out, and his feet grew hard on the trail. It was inevitable that the clash of leadership between Spitz and Buck should come. They pulled into Dawson one dreary afternoon. Here were many men and many dogs. And Buck found them all at work. All day long, they swung up and down the main street in long teams. And every night, with the aurora borealis flaming coldly overhead, the dogs lifted a nocturnal song. It was a song as old as the breed itself. One of the first songs of the younger world, invested with the woe of unnumbered generations. Buck moaned and sobbed, the same pain as his ancestors. The fear in him of dark and cold harked back through the ages of fire and roof to the raw beginnings of life. After 7 days in Dawson, the team turned around, pulled back up the Yukon Trail, and headed back toward Daya with a new batch of mail. That night, Doug turned up a snowshoe rabbit. The rabbit sped down the river. The whole team took off after it. Buck was ranging at the head of the pack, running the wild thing down. There is an ecstasy that marks the summit of life. It comes to the artist in a sheet of flame. It comes to the soldier, war mad on a stricken field. And it came to Buck, running at the head of the pack, sounding the old wolf cry, straining after the food that was alive and fled swiftly before him through the moonlight.
Spitz, cold and calculating, left the pack and cut across a narrow neck of land where the creek made a long bend around.
Buck didn't notice. And when he rounded the bend, he saw the frosty breath of the rabbit still flitting before him. He saw another, larger frost wraith leap from the overhanging bank into the immediate path of the rabbit. It was Spitz. The full pack at Buck's heels raised a hell's chorus of delight. Buck did not cry out. He did not check himself. He drove in upon Spitz, shoulder to shoulder, so hard, missed the throat. For Curly, he thought, to the death. They rolled over and over in the powdery snow. Spitz, getting his feet, slashed Buck down the shoulder. As they circled about, the scene came to Buck with a sense of familiarity. He seemed to remember it all. The moonlight, the thrill of battle. Fang clashed fang. Lips were cut and bleeding. Buck enveloped Spitz in a whirlwind of rushes. Time and time again he tried for the snow-white throat. And each time, Spitz slashed him and got away. Spitz was untouched. Buck was streaming with blood and panting hard. The fight grew desperate. All the while, the silent wolfish circle waited to finish off whichever dog went down. Now, Buck fought by instinct, but he could use his head as well. He possessed a quality made for greatness: imagination. He rushed as if attempting the old shoulder trick, but at the last instant swept low to the snow and in. His teeth wrapped around Spitz's left foreleg, the crunch of breaking bone. Spitz struggled madly to keep up. There was no hope for him. Buck maneuvered for the final rush. He struck. The circle became a dot on the moon-flooded snow as Spitz disappeared from view. Buck stood and looked on. The successful champion, the dominant primordial beast, had made his kill and found it good. What'd I say, huh? I speak true when I say, that Buck, two devils. This was Francois' speech the following morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered in wounds.
That Spitz fight like hell, said Perrault
As he surveyed the gaping ribs and cuts.
And Buck, fight like two hells. And now we make good time, huh? No more Spitz, no more trouble, for sure.
As Perrault packed the camp and loaded the sled, Francois harnessed the dogs. There was no place for Buck save the front. The tone of the team picked up immediately. It had recovered its old time solidarity, and once more the dogs leapt as one in the traces.
Never such a dog as that Buck, huh? He worth $1,000, by God.
Buck felt his instincts, the habits of his ancestors, become alive again. In one run, they made a 60-mile dash from the foot of Lake Labarge to the White Horse Rapids. And on the last night, they dropped down the sea slope with the lights of Skagway at their feet. It was a record run. Each day, for 14 days, they'd averaged 40 miles.
Perrault and Francois slew their chests up and down the main street and were deluged with invitations to drink. The team was the constant center of worship. Next came official orders. Francois threw his arms round Buck and wept. That was the last of Francois and Perrault.
Like other men, they'd passed out of Buck's life for good. Three days passed in which Buck realized how weak he was. On the morning of the fourth day, two men from the States came along and bought them, harness and all, for a song. Charles was middle-aged, with watery eyes and a mustache that twisted up. Hal was 19, with a big Colt revolver and a hunting knife. Why they would adventure the north is a mystery that passes understanding. The new owner's camp was a slovenly affair. Tent half stretched, dishes unwashed, everything in disorder. Buck saw a woman. Mercedes. Buck watched them load the sled. They don't have a clue, he thought. Three men from a neighboring tent came out grinning. Now, I don't mean to tell you your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent alone if I was you. Undreamed of. Ain't no hotels where you're going. Plenty of other things. Wolves, bears tall as a house. Well, I tell you what, you won't be laughing when we return with a wagon full of gold. Too bad you ain't got nowhere to put it. The men left, chuckling off to the bar. How? Took his spot. On the sled. sled. Mush. Mush on there. The dogs spring against the breastband. No! The overloaded sled wouldn't budge. Now, look, I don't give a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dog's sake, you gotta break the sled out of the ice. Hal broke out the runners. And they forged ahead. Buck and his mates struggled under the rain of blows. 100 yards ahead, the path turned and sloped onto the main street. It would have required an experienced man to keep the top-heavy sled upright. Hal wasn't it, Buck thought. Buck swung extra wide in the turn. The sled went over, spilling half its load. Buck, laughing, took off into a run, the rest of the team following. Hal was pulled off his feet. He yelled for them to stop! Buck wasn't about to listen. He ran that sled right over Hal, and as the dogs tore down the street, dragging the overturned sled, the streets of Skagway burst into laughter. In the nature of Arctic travel, there is a reason why 14 dogs should not drag along one sled. One sled can't carry enough food for 14 dogs. Buck knew there's no dependent on these people. Some days, they didn't make 10 miles. Other days, they didn't get started at all. It was inevitable they'd go short on food. Not only do they not know how to work dogs, Buck mused, they don't know how to work themselves. Charles and Hal would wrangle whenever Mercedes gave them a chance. They each believed they did more of the work. In the meantime, fire remained unbuilt, camp half-pitched, and the dogs unfed. They were worn out and worn down. Buck's 150 pounds had whittled down to 115. This was the state of Buck's team the day I first laid eyes on them. It was beautiful spring weather, though neither the dogs nor the humans were aware of it. Each day the sun rose earlier, set later. All things were thawing, bending, snapping. The Yukon was breaking loose from the cold that bound it. Amid this awakening life, like wayfarers to death, staggered in the 2 men, woman, and huskies into my camp. I was whittling the last touches of an axe handle. I'd started from a branch of birch. Hal did the talking. They told us the bottom would be dropping out of the trail, that the best thing we could do was lay over, that we wouldn't make White River, but here we are. What they had been told was true. The bottom would drop out at any moment. Only fools with the blind luck of fools could have made it. I wouldn't risk my carcass on that ice for all the gold in Alaska. All the same, we're going on to Dawson. I watched as Hal commanded his team to get on with it. He struck with his whip.
Buck didn't budge. So greatly had he suffered. So far had he gone. The blows didn't hurt him much. In what he thought his last moments on this earth, Buck heard a voice, a man's voice.
My voice. Cry out for him.
Ah! Hal was hurled backward. Mercedes screamed.
Charles didn't dare try it.
I stood over Buck, too convulsed with rage. You strike that dog again, I'll kill you.
He's my dog.
Hal drew his knife. I whacked his hand with the axe handle. He dropped that knife real quick, whacked his hand again when he tried to pick it up. In 2 quick strokes, I cut Buck from the traces. He knew them. He belonged to them no more. A few minutes later, they pulled up the bank, took off down the river. Dog and man, we watched them, crawling over the ice. Suddenly, the back end of the sled went down as if into a rut. Mercedes screamed. Charles turned around, took 1 step to run back, and the whole section of ice gave way. They disappeared. A yawning hole was all that was to be seen. The bottom had dropped out of the trail. Buck looked on as his team, his sled, and those insufferable people vanished into the icy river. I looked at him. He looked at me. Poor devil. My name is John Thornton. I had come up the previous December. Buck's wounds healed. His muscles swole out, and the flesh came back to cover his bones. Buck grew to love me, and I grew to love him. Buck had a trick. He would seize my hand in his jaws till my flesh bore the imprint of his teeth. An expression of love. Kind of hurt. Buck feared he would lose me, like all the masters that had come before. Sometimes at night, he knelt at the foot of my tent, listened to me breathe. Deep in the forest, a call was sounding. Buck felt compelled to plunge after it. But as often as he turned to leave, it was the bond he shared with me that brought him back. Buck would answer that call, but not before he sealed his reputation as the most famous dog in the whole history of Alaska. The El Dorado Saloon was a place where men boasted of their favorite dogs. Buck was talked about a lot. A drunk claimed his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds. Here, my boy can pull 6 in a lick. Here, mine can pull 7. Being well beyond my first drink of the evening. Pooh! Pooh! Buck could start 1,000 pounds. Unfortunately, this caught the ear of a man with money. A king of the bonanza mine named Doc Mathewson. And break it out. And walk with it for 100 yards. And break it out and walk with it for 100 yards, I said, without stopping to think. Well, so the entire bar could hear, I've got $1,000 that says he can't. And here it is, slamming down a sack of gold dust the size of a bologna sausage. He called my bluff. I didn't know if Buck could start 1,000 pounds. And I've got a sled standing outside now with 20, 50-pound sacks of flour on it. I didn't know what to say. The face of Jim O'Brien, the Mastodon King, an old friend, caught my eye. Could you lend me 1,000? I mouthed, barely a whisper. Sure. Thumping down a sack of gold dust beside Matthewson's. But it's little faith I'm having, John, that the beast can do the trick. The El Dorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, stood around Matthewson's sled, piled high with 1,000 pounds of flour. In the 60 below, intense cold, the runners were frozen fast. Men offered odds 2 to 1. Buck couldn't even budge the sled. Buck could feel the excitement in the air. He knew he must do a great thing for me. He was in perfect condition. His coat shone with the sheen of silk. Men felt his muscles hard as iron. Gad, sir. Gad, sir, stuttered a member of the latest dynasty, a king of the Skookum benches. I'll give you 800 for him, sir. 800, sir. Before the test, sir. 800, just as he stands. The crowd fell silent. I knelt beside Buck, put his head in my hands. As you love me, Buck. As you love me. Buck seized my hand in his jaws. Like he'd done so many times before. It was his answer, right? In turn, I mean, not a speech, but love. All right. Now, Buck! Buck, tighten the traces! And then slacked them for a matter of several inches in the way he had learned. All right. Gee! Buck swung wide to the right! The load quivered, and from under the runners was heard a crisp crackling. Oh! The crackling became a snapping. The load quivering. The runners sliding and grating several inches to the side. Men unconsciously held their breath. Now! Mush! Buck threw himself forward. The sled swayed and trembled. One of his feet slipped. A man groaned aloud. And then the sled began to lurch forward in a rapid succession of jerks. Half an inch, 2 inches, and then, gaining momentum, the sled began to move steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again. I ran behind shouting encouragement, and as the sled neared the pile of firewood that marked the edge of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow and grow and burst into a roar as the sled passed the firewood and halted on command. Every man tore himself loose. Even Matthewson, hats and mittens, flew into the air. Men shaking hands. It didn't matter with whom. I fell to my knees beside Buck, head against head. Gad, sir. Gad, sir, spluttered the Skookum Bench King. I'll give you 1,000 for it, sir. 1,000, sir. 1,200, sir. I looked at him in the eyes, tears streaming down my cheeks. Sir, you can go to hell. Best I can do for you, sir. I reached down. Buck seized my hand in his jaws. Like he'd done so many times before. I shook him. That's my boy, Buck! That's my boy! Adventure grows deep in a man's heart. Just as Buck heard his call deep in the forest, I heard mine. When Buck made $1,600 in 5 minutes, my heart pointed east on an unknown trail. We found a place across a valley where the gold showed like yellow butter. Each day we worked earned us thousands of dollars. We sacked that gold in moose-hide bags, 50 pounds each, piled it up like firewood, like giants. We heaped the treasure up. Buck spent long hours musing by the fire. The call, sounding in the depths of the forest, filled him with strange desires. One night, he sprung from asleep from the forest, distinct and definite as never before. Buck sprang from the sleeping camp and dashed through the trees until he came upon an open place in the woods. He saw a long, lean timber wolf. The wolf fled. Buck followed, ran him into a blind channel where a timber jam barred the way. The wolf whirled about. Buck didn't attack, but circled about in friendly advances. The wolf was suspicious. Buck weighed 3 times as much. He made it clear to Buck to come, and they ran straight up the creek bed, through the twilight, across the great divide. Buck was ecstatic. He'd done this thing before. His cunning was wolf cunning. His intelligence, St. Bernard intelligence. All this, plus experience in the fiercest of schools, made him as formidable a creature as any who roamed the wild. As fall came, the moose appeared. A band of 20 crossed over, and chief among them, a great bull, stood over 6 feet. From the bull's side, a feathered arrow accounted for his savageness. There was no way for Buck to know. He was not the only one hunting this great beast. Guided by primordial instinct, Buck cut the bull from the herd. For half a day, Buck multiplied himself, attacking from all angles, enveloping the herd in a whirlwind of menace. Buck never gave it a moment's rest, never left his prey, never gave the wounded bull the opportunity to quench his burning thirst in the streams they crossed. As twilight fell, the old bull stood with lowered head. In the end, death came at the teeth of a creature whose head did not reach beyond his great buckling knees. The end came quick for us. I wasn't alive to see Buck return from bringing the big moose down. As he came back to camp, Buck sensed something was wrong. 3 miles out, he came upon a fresh scent that sent the hair on his neck bristling. Along the path, he came upon one of his partners, a sled dog dead, an arrow protruding head and feathers from either side of his body. From the camp came the faint sound of many voices rising and falling in a chant. Belling forward to the edge of a clearing, he found a miner lying face down, feathered with arrows like a porcupine.
A gust of overpowering rage swept over him.
The Yeehats were dancing about the wreckage of our camp when they heard a roar and saw rushing upon them an animal like they'd never seen before.
Buck sprang at the chief, split the throat wide open until the jugular spouted a fountain of blood. He plunged about. There was no withstanding him. Rending, tearing, destroying in constant terrific motion.
Buck was so fast, and the Indians so close together, they shot each other with their own arrows. A young hunter hurled a spear at Buck and went through the chest of another hunter with such force, the point broke through his back. Panic seized the Yeehats, and they fled in terror through the woods, proclaiming the birth of an evil spirit. Buck was the fiend incarnate, chasing them down like deer, raging at their heels as they fled through the trees. It was a fateful day for the Yeehats. Wasn't until a week later the last of the survivors gathered together in the lower valley to count their losses. Buck returned to camp. My own desperate struggle was fresh written on the earth. And Buck scented every detail of it down to the edge of a deep pool in the water, muddy and discolored from the sluice boxes from which we had pulled so much gold. He found my body. It left a great void in him. He had killed man, noblest of all game, but it was love that tore him most. Night came on, and a full moon rose high over the trees. From far away drifted a faint, sharp yelp. Buck moved to the center of the clearing and listened. It was the many-noted call, sounding more luring and compelling than ever before. I was gone. The last tie broken. Man and the claims of men no longer bounded. Into the clearing where the moonlight streamed, the wolf pack poured in a silvery flood. And in the center of the clearing stood Buck, motionless as a statue. They were awed. So still and large he stood. One wolf, long, lean, and gray, advanced cautiously. Buck recognized him as the wild brother with whom he had run a night and a day. He whined softly, and as Buck whined, they touched noses. Then an old wolf came forward, gaunt and battle-scarred. Buck writhed his lips into the start of a snarl, but the old wolf sat down, pointed his face at the moon, and broke out the long wolf howl. And it came to Buck in unmistakable accents. He pointed his face at the stars and joined in the call of his brothers. The leaders lifted the yelp of the pack and sprang away into the woods, the rest of the wolves following, and Buck ran with them. Side by side, the wild brother howling as he ran. This may well end the story of Buck. The years were not many when the Yeehats noted a change in the breed of Timberwolf. For many were seen with brown on head and muzzle, and a rift of white centering down the chest. The Yeehats tell of a ghost dog. They're afraid of him, for he has cunning greater than they. But he's not always alone. On the long winter nights, he can be seen running at the head of the pack, sounding the old wolf cry. His great throat a bellow, singing the songs of the underworld. The call of the wild.